And I think we can, I mean, we're still a little bit early. Um, we're gonna wait, yeah, a couple more minutes so that everyone can join. Hi, Hosni. I'm seeing another guest has joined as well. And I think we are live. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the quarantine sessions. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, the
You're still
quarantine
early. You're still before six. Before yeah.
before 4. But as people are going to join, I wanted to just lay out this idea that during the quarantine, there's a lot that we can still do. There's a lot of things that we can still learn. There's a lot of interesting conversations to have. So yeah, we're hoping that you send us your questions, you send us your concerns. Um, we have a very special guest today, which I'm going to introduce in 2 minutes. Ayman Ashour. And yeah, we're looking forward to hearing where you're tuning in from. We have guests from Egypt, we have guests from Kuwait. Hosni saying hello, everyone, as well. So please tell us where you're tuning in from. If you want to put a little icon, a little flag, and send us your questions, we would be super happy to hear from you. We're already live on Facebook, it looks. Um, it's 2 minutes to 8. We're starting. What time is it there, Ayman? Are we on the same time
Uh,
zone?
yes, I think so. Yes, yeah. But it
Okay,
is a bit of
good.
delay, I think, between the Facebook. I can't hear you now.
You cannot hear me now?
Oh no, no, I can hear you, but I was looking at Facebook and it is delayed.
Okay. Yeah. We see a little bit later on Facebook
Yes.
as well. You can send your questions either through the webinar Q&A, the webinar comment, or you can send your questions on the Facebook comments. We're going to be checking both. So we're going to have a very interactive dialogue. These sessions during Ramadan are in partnership with the Cairo Angels. We are thrilled about this partnership because it allows us to host investors and advisors such as Ayman himself to get some advice and some interesting insights for the entrepreneurs. We're going to wait 1 more minute so that everyone has the time to join. And we are going to start. We'll be talking about crisis management today, which is, I mean, what a topic. And we're going to go through an imaginary journey, basically, because Ayman has been running businesses basically all over the world across different continents and going through several crises as well. Well, I think it's 8 p.m. We have some participants already both on the webinar and on Facebook. Let's start. Welcome once again to the quarantine sessions. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have a spectacular guest. He's an entrepreneur. He is an investor. He is an advisor. His name is Ayman Ashour. Thank you so much, Ayman, for joining us.
Pleasure, Valentina. Pleasure.
So we wanted to start with sort of an imaginary journey around throughout your career, throughout your story as a founder. When did you leave Egypt? Where exactly did you go? What kind of business did you at first found?
Sure. Well, I left Egypt as a young age. I left Egypt, I think I was about 15 years old or so. So I lived for a couple of years in Kuwait. Then I ended up going to England. Uh, and from England, I went for another year in Egypt, and then I moved to California. So I spent most of my life in the U.S. And but from the U.S. as as an American, Egyptian American, I also then had several stays abroad. So I lived in Asia for a number of years, for 3 years. And I lived in different parts of Europe. And I ended up actually starting my biggest and most successful business. I ended up starting in Switzerland and Germany, and before taking it back to the US. Um, in a nutshell, I always, I'm 60 years old, so I always like to divide my life into 20, 20, 20. So sort of 20 years sort of education and all the rest of that, 20 years corporate world, and, sort of moving up up the corporate ladder, starting out in engineering, moving on to management, moving on to uh, sales and marketing, moving on to strategic management and mergers and acquisitions, and then 20 years starting my own businesses, a number of businesses between the US, Italy, where you're at right now, and Switzerland, Germany, and even Canada. So that's in a nutshell about myself.
Right, right. What was that first business about? What was the core business or the business model?
Most people know me sort of as someone who's in the security and in the RFID technology. So security and ID technology is really the area that I've been most interested in for the last, sort of security for all my career, but RFID and ID technology for the last 20 years. And so the business was really focused on specific part of ID technology, which is high frequency identification and RFID, and using that technology in a variety of ways, sort of like from things like e-passports to transportation cards to games and sort of figurines in games, and that's a technology that's also used in payment. It's very and that sort of thing.
Right, right, right. I can imagine, I mean, as a founder, as you said, you went through very different countries. What were the challenges of starting up from the beginning? What were the main challenges you encountered across these countries?
Well, when obviously issues of culture, issues of language, issues of people expectations, sort of you've got different challenges in different markets. I always tell people that when I was raising funds, I spent about 18 months, maybe close to 2 years raising funds. I was not too long ago, I was going through my computer. My Mac has a finite storage, so I was trying to create some space. So I found that I had about 248 different versions of my pitch presentation for my, when I was starting the company. And I had so many no's. I had so many, no, doesn't quite fit us. I had so many really encouraging things, and getting into term sheets and getting into investment committee stages and getting signed term sheets, and then having things getting pulled, at the very last minute. So, so I think the biggest challenge has been, sort of being able to present my vision in a way that was appealing enough for people, and being able to get the investors to feel that there's a high level of confidence they're going to make a lot of money out of this. And that took a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of travel, doing that.
Right, right. I guess it's a universal challenge for an entrepreneur, right? The issue of confidence.
Yes, and that's why I, quite often, when a lot of entrepreneurs right now are complaining about how difficult it is, raising money. Yeah, I understand. I can relate to that, but that's the name of the game. And when I look at my own, sort of presentations and how they evolved, over, from version 1 to version 248, it is remarkable how they actually got much better, much crisper, much clearer. And how sometimes there are certain things that are very clear in your head, And I found that no, I have to actually spell them out very clearly. And you have a finite amount of time for your pitch sessions. So you have to be able to distill a lot of things into something that's very coherent, very clear, that people can relate to.
Right, right, right. Um, you've been through so many different periods and as we said, so many different countries, right? Um, what kind of crisis did you have to go through throughout your whole life?
Well, you got many different crises. When when I moved to Hong Kong, and that was being part of a large company. I moved to Hong Kong to run the Asian businesses. A group of Asian companies. Asia Pacific. So I had probably about 25 different companies with total number of people, multiple thousands, and we ended up actually acquiring a guarding company. So it ended up being close to 70,000 people. But at some point when I first went, it was about, eight or 10,000 people between Indonesia, China, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong itself, and then at some point Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. So when you're going into these countries, and then the big uncertainty, which you knew was coming, was the Hong Kong handover back to China. But that remarkably wasn't a big issue. What was a huge issue was the Asian market crisis and the Asian collapse. And that was a very scary time. I remember, it was so scary to the point that there were sort of like suicides, people, killing themselves, and, every other day. I remember one day I was running somewhere, morning jogging, and I'm coming back and the street's closed because somebody's, jumped off of a building, so it was a really scary time.
Wow.
We were opening a factory in Indonesia. We had, a couple of thousand people in Indonesia. We had a lot of expats in Indonesia. We had about 50 expats between, American, Brits, Australians, and with their families. It was about 200 people. And then Indonesia went into a revolution and chaos, and there was riots. It was a very scary time. It was similar. I don't know if you were in Egypt during January 25th and,
I
year
arrived
2000.
later.
Yeah,
I
so it
arrived,
was very similar time to that, and it was very high risk.
yeah,
And with the currency collapse, we were just in the process of opening a factory. We had what at the time when I went in, this business was like a $65 million business. With the currency collapse, it became an $18 million business.
right.
And yet your cost base was so high. So, because as I said, we had 45 expats, with their families. So, and then when there was riots, we had to evacuate people. As I was telling you before, one time I actually had to hire an aeroplane from Singapore Airlines to get our people out. So
Right.
it was very difficult to have a very large investment in a country and go through a complete meltdown like we did. So different. And when I was starting my company, my first company was in 2001, and being in the security business with a name like Ayman Ashour going around the US was not exactly the best of times,
Right.
to sort of as a Egyptian Muslim American, in right after 9/11. That was difficult. And my last company, Blue Hill ID, which became Identiv, was started in 2008 with the financial crisis. So you've it's part of life. None of these crises are anywhere near as deep or as similar to the current one that we're going through now. So I don't try to pretend that I can, that I can navigate through the one we're going through now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. As we said earlier, right? It's a completely unprecedented crisis. There is very little clue into in terms of what to expect and how, how the market could react, how even how the pandemic could evolve, right? Um,
Exactly.
Now, as a leader, as a founder, how do you think one can best manage the situation?
Well, I, I sort of like, as the title of the seminar, I really I go by, you know, roughly speaking, 5 rules.
Hmm.
And they are all equally important. And the first rule is about managing morale of the team.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've always noticed is people saying, the morale is low, I have to do something about it. Now you have to think, why is the morale low? The is low because of uncertainty. The morale is low because of very valid reasons why the morale is low.
Right.
So you cannot artificially try to sugarcoat things. So you have to be realistic. You have to accept that for a period of time, the morale will be low because it has to be low. If the morale is not low, the people are working for you are crazy.
Yeah.
It's a tough time. All of us, the whole globe right now, the morale is low. So it is normal for the morale. So you need to accept to function at the time when the morale is low and don't try to sugarcoat it. Now, if you try to sugarcoat it, you end up with something like the Trump phenomena or the president of Brazil, who are ending up, people then end up looking at them and saying there is a disconnect. You actually lose respect because
Mm.
people don't believe you.
Yeah.
So your second rule is really, how are you seen when you're dealing with these issues? Your body language, are you seen as panicking? Early in my career at really difficult times, I used to almost like run around the office, race around the office, and thinking that was, I'm sending the right signal.
Mm.
And as you mature with the years, you discover, no, that was a wrong thing to do, because that was signaling panic. So what was the toughest of times, what I learned to do is to focus on my tone, focus on my voice, focus on my body language, focus on smiling, focus on being coherent and clear. So that's how you really deal with the morale. The first 2 items, my first 2 rules, if you will, don't sugarcoat, but have an image of a rational thinking, positive body language, not panicking.
Right. Right.
Third rule that I always, I cannot emphasize enough is the issue of liquidity,
Hmm.
cash flow, oxygen.
Hmm.
Your business is, you need oxygen. That oxygen is liquidity. So you need to be thinking cash flow, emphasizing cash flow day in and day out. You may end up um, not accepting certain customers because their payment terms is not good enough. You may opt for a supplier, a more expensive supplier, because his payment terms are better than another supplier. You may have to accept investment at much lower valuations than you've contemplated, ever contemplated. I used to pride myself on when I was raising money for my company, and I raised a lot of money with different rounds. I
Right.
used to always pride myself on always increasing the valuation, and I saw that as a challenge. But we hit very tough time, and I've had to actually do down rounds. And it is so difficult to do that as an entrepreneur. It is really tough, but you have to do it, because without that oxygen, you're dead.
Right. Right. So
So, so liquidity, cash flow is a really important issue.
you do advise,
Sorry, go ahead.
you do advise rejecting customers based on payment terms, because I was wondering during this period where the people's purchase power is being reduced, and customers are not exactly online, are not exactly shopping, whether online or offline. Is it something you would advise in order to take care of cash flow?
Absolutely, because your cash flow is king. In normal times, as a startup, you may look at, sort of a really important customer as a top priority, a really good name. I don't care how long they're going to pay. I just want to be able to say that XYZ is my customer. It's a landmark customer. But that is not really, in a crisis time, you want the customer who's going to pay, might even be less profitable, but who's going to pay and pay on time, pay up front, get 50% down, that sort of thing. So because you are in a, wanting to make sure you've got enough oxygen all the time.
Right. Next lesson then.
The next item is really decisive, quick action. Don't dither. It might be that you have to pivot, change your business model radically. It might be that you have to have major cost reduction, and you might have to, sort of, I always say that you may have to cut an arm or a leg to save the body. It's very painful, but you may have to do it, and you have to do it quickly. But it's not necessarily cost reduction. It could be a pivoting, changing direction completely. And so the flexibility and the agility of a startup really comes, is brought home when you're able to move very quickly. Sometimes I find that startups, particularly in the Middle East, are and developing countries in general, are so afraid of failure. So they end up dithering. They end up going into endless meetings and discussions about pivoting and before they alter themselves. And if you see, it is clear that there is a crisis, there's uncertainty, but there is an opportunity here, you need to pivot and move quickly. Because you need to know that, at this time, however, we don't know how long it's going to be, wherever long it is going to be, you're not going to be doing an exit. You're not going to be doing, a big valuation, sale. You are going to be really wanting to keep this thing alive for the next year or 2 years. So how are you going to do that? So decisive action, quickly pivot. And the final item is what I call realistic optimism. And it's a little bit of a sort of, it may come across a bit contradictory, because being realistic sometimes could be very negative. So being realistic, it might means that your business is not going to survive, that that, and that the right thing to do now is to freeze, hibernate, close it down. But you have also to be optimistic. So so there is a fine line between delusion and optimism, and it's not really that fine when you get closer to it. But so you need to be optimistic, because that optimism, if it is based on realistic attitude, will help you be confident when you're talking to customers, to suppliers, to everybody else. But the optimism needs to be underpinned in realism. So these are really the 5 rules that I recommend for crisis management. Any crisis. I've been really impressed with some of the young startups that I see who've just been phenomenal. And that's why really I haven't wanted to do any webinars before this one, because I didn't feel I had so much to give when I can see people doing really clever things. But
Right.
to the extent I can help, these are the 5 things I can help with.
Right, right. Stopping for a minute on the last lesson. Now, how can we be realistic when we don't know what's going to happen? Or rather, how can we prepare
Um,
for how, what we don't know?
sure. That's part of the difficulty. So, if you are an existing business now and you have a team, you have a function, you have customers, you have all of that. So you can, start making some assumptions about what is going to happen in June, July, August, September, October, next April, next May. Start making some assumptions. Start testing some of these assumptions with your customers or with your potential customers. And when I'm saying start testing it with, you can sometimes talk to them. You can sometimes just look at their behavior, look at their announcements, look at what they are saying in public, in private, as much as you can to see where they are going. So that will help you see where the general market is going. Now, you might be right, you might be wrong, and you might need to pivot to fit in with that story more. So it is all about assumptions at this point because we don't know what's going to happen.
Right, right. Just the other day, we were talking about, how this could impact and how this is, in fact, right now impacting markets. What have you been seeing, and what do you think are the scenarios that could come into play?
Um, well, we don't really know what's going on. That we have, as someone who's trying to figure out what's going to happen. You have an unprecedented level of government action around the world. Governments are taking unbelievable action because the governments are taking this situation very seriously and are all around the world moving, investing very heavily to try to keep the economies from collapsing. You're talking about, sort of like I'm here in England. It's a conservative government, supposedly physically conservative. What they have done is unbelievable in terms of trying to keep the economy going. The US, same way, Italy, the same way, France, the same way. So the governments trying to inject liquidity and central banks trying to buy corporate bonds and trying to make sure that the borrowing market for corporations is going to minimize bankruptcies and the like is incredible. So this is source of optimism. I know for a lot of people who are struggling, it doesn't feel enough, but ultimately, if you don't have huge numbers of companies going bankrupt, that gives you optimism that there will be, an upturn that is things are gonna come back. Um, so, uh, so that's one of the things that you're seeing. But the reality is we do not know, because we do not know if the leveling of the curve is going to work. It's encouraging to see what's happening in Germany. It's encouraging to see what's happening in Italy. I loved seeing your pictures going out on the street, so in Rome.
Yeah.
So that is encouraging, but we don't know if if you're going to have to go through another lockdown in Italy, in 2 months' time. We don't know if how bad the situation in in places is going to be. It's optimistic that to see in Wuhan, in China itself, things are continuing to be improving, but with the way the Chinese reporting in media, you don't have a lot of confidence. So we're really waiting to see what happens in Italy, Spain, and Germany, and the UK as things come out.
Right, right. We have a question from one of the participants, Amir Rahman. He's saying, "Hi, Valentina. Thank you for bringing Ayman on such an informative session. What are the lessons learned from Europe and Asia in dealing with the current crisis from a business and from a personal perspective?"
Hi, Amir. Nice to hear from you. Uh, well, I guess the big lessons that we can see is what the European governments are doing, is that they are going all out in trying to protect businesses from going bankrupt, and they are trying to go all out in trying to minimize the pain at the individual level, and they are trying to flatten the curve to preserve the integrity of the healthcare systems, etc. So that's what they are basically trying to do, and I think that is the most sensible thing. It's anytime you have somebody who's only focusing on the economy, switch channel. Somebody who's only focused on healthcare and epidemic and all of that, switch channel. Anybody who's only focused on psychological effects, switch channel. You need to have all of these things together. And I think Italy and Germany have, and Austria and several Central European countries have been incredibly thoughtful about the approach to this whole thing. And I think the sensible world is copying them more and more. And that's a lesson on a macro level. On a micro level, Amir, it really depends on a case-by-case basis. I can give you examples of different startups that I'm close to, and I see. I can give you example of a company like Marja in Egypt, where their business is taking people traveling from one country to another. They have pivoted to online courses, and all of that. And it is really humbling to see what that team is doing in reaction to this. You see a company like Meraiti and Rumuz Sadeh in Jordan, and her business is hairdressers sending makeup artists and hairdressers to people's homes. That is obviously not happening right now. So she switched to selling beauty products online. That was a small part of her business, was 15% of her business. It's now 100% of her business, and with courses and all of that. You've got, so different people are doing different things, and it varies really, from one place to the other. I mean, look at Valentina, Startup Without Borders. She's what she's doing now and switching to webinars.
Right, right, right. I think also Amir was kind of wondering about your personal lessons throughout the crisis that you've dealt with, right? So when you were in Asia, the evacuation, for example.
Yeah.
So what kind of lessons in terms of leadership and
It is really what I mentioned in terms of you need to accept the problem. You cannot sugarcoat. Do not sugarcoat. If you try to sugarcoat, people will dismiss you. People won't take you seriously. The decisive action, you need to move quickly. If you need to cut cost, don't dither. Don't be afraid of cutting costs because it's going to affect morale. Because to save the body, you gotta cut an arm, you gotta cut a leg, it's gonna be painful, but you have to move quickly. You gotta be realistic, you gotta be optimistic, and your cash flow. So these are the lessons, Amir. And it is, you really need to apply them, to your particular case. People quite often tell me, I don't want to cut cost because it's going to be destroying the morale. yes, it is going to be very negative for the morale. But if you don't cut cost and you end up running out of money and you end up closing down, that's also negative for the morale. And people then, the people who are you're afraid of now, being demotivated, will criticize you for being weak and not moving fast enough to reduce cost, or to pivot, So I don't want to be harping on cost as the only thing. And it is not an issue of not being kind, because ultimately, as a manager, your ultimate responsibility is to the entity you're managing.
Right. Right. We have another question from Amr Tawab. Hello, Valentina and Ayman. As you mentioned, you may end up with cutting an arm or a leg to save the body. Which arm may a business start with in such a pandemic as we face in the meantime?
Thank you, Amr, for the question. I think you need to look at I give you one very specific business priority in my rules, which is your cash flow.
Right.
So you might have some big strategic initiative that is really important, that is so core, but is not going to generate any cash for the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. That might be the thing that you have to cut, even though it is so strategic, so important, and it is, really exciting, unique. You have to do it. So it might be that you work very hard to hire these people, but you have to do it. So you prioritize the things that will bring you cash. And if once you say, this is my priority, you need to look at your runway and then decide what you're going to cut and what you're going to keep.
Right. What do you think, I'm asking now a question from the investor seat now, right? Let's change seat for a minute. What is an investor now when listening to a pitch kind of focusing on in terms of how the entrepreneur is dealing with the pandemic? What kind of questions may arise, and how should the entrepreneur show preparation and show confidence in his business despite the context?
Right. I think what I look at this point of time is realism. So, because if the person in front of me is not realistic, doesn't understand the uncertainty, then that is a really big negative for me. Take, for example, we all know, like, I love online games. I'm really active in games, and games companies right now are booming. I mean, if you talk to people like Joseph Shumali or Ahmed Ala Bondo in Encrypted or Play Arabi, and these two guys, they love epidemics. They want this to continue because people are at home and they are spending money and they are in heaven. And, they are really a small sample. They're like a Netflix. Netflix is doing very well. Zoom is doing very well. The question is, when you talk to somebody like Joseph Shumali, was fantastic, because he said, Ayman, I know this is really good now, but I don't expect it to last for very long, because as people, as the standard of living deteriorates and as people disposable income is lessened, they're going to be spending less money.
Right.
So if you are talking to somebody who's in retail now, or grocery, or online delivery, it might be that the business has boomed for the last 3 months because people are ordering a lot of things online and they are buying and all of that. But that is not necessarily, if you're in the toilet roll business, you would have been having a great time, but will that continue?
Right. True.
So it is really the realism is a key thing, to look for at this case. And just coming back to your question is, anytime your startup is very high risk.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that. um, you know in the US, it used to be that, 1 out of 6 succeeds, 5 fail, or maybe 1 out of 10. I don't know if you've seen different things. So that's in ordinary times, when we have a level of certainty, when we don't have an epidemic, when we don't have all of that. At this point of time, we have all of this added uncertainty. We don't know what the exchange rates are going to be. We don't know what the inflation is going to be. We don't know whether your customers, because if you're a B2B, you don't even know if your customer is going to be there or not. So you have so much uncertainty. So when you have somebody who is a gung-ho attitude without a level of realism, that is a massive turnoff.
Right, right. Very good tips. Very good tips here. We have another question coming from Facebook. Hazem Abdel Sattar Kamal. Thanks, Valentina and Ayman. With the current cash flow issues and no clear vision for the pandemic, what could be the basis for pivoting? As I might start today and pay expenses to cover 6 months, and then it ends after a month.
Well, that's a really good problem to have. So thank you, Hazem, for the question. It goes back to making assumptions, because if you don't pivot, you're making an assumption. If you pivot, you're making an assumption. So if you don't pivot, you're making an assumption that it is going to be over in a month. If you pivot and go into a different direction, you're making an assumption that it is not going to be over in a month, and that this direction you're pivoting to is going to be more rewarding, down the line, and will preserve your cash, etc., or generate cash and will be helpful to you. So it is really the balance of the probability and your assessment of that. So you're making assumptions, you're trying to weigh them. The main thing is, don't dither. Don't, because if you're a startup, your big asset is your agility, your ability to move quickly. That is the big advantage you have over huge companies. So your ability to pivot quickly.
Right, right. There's another question from Amrta Web. How can you explain to us how huge corporates, companies, and startups like Lyft, Airbnb, Careem, etc., can lay off all those huge numbers of employees only in 3 or 4 months of the crisis life? Was that misplanning? And how such companies are not preparing always for such crisis in situations?
Well, what you're seeing is basically cutting arms and legs. Is what you're doing. So whether it's Uber, I was looking at, a friend of mine actually sent me their internal announcements, and cutting so many different people, and all of that. That is cutting arms and legs, and to save the overall body. And it is it's painful. I can tell you, I've had to do it. I've had to close factories, I've had to close offices, I've had to let people go, and it is very painful thing to do. I still remember the very first time I've had to do it. I couldn't sleep all night.
Right.
I was sick to my stomach, that I'm gonna have to go and lay people off, and it was difficult, but you have to do it, because I love this American expression of live to fight another day. If you don't live, you die. Then you have no chance of fighting and succeeding again.
Right, right, right. I'm curious to know. I have a question now. Uh, what is the decision that you're most proud of? You were just saying, these decisions that you took in moments of crisis that where you couldn't sleep. What is the one decision that you're most proud of throughout all these years?
I don't know, Valentina. I can tell you, I can tell you, I'm sort of like proud that I can look back and figure out my mistakes. Clearly I can, I'm proud that I can sort of like, feel at peace with mistakes and weaknesses and, and stuff that I made. So and understand in my head, why I made them. I think one of the things for me that I'm always, I've always sort of lived by a motto of, I don't care if you don't like me as long as you understand me.
Right.
So I'm proud of being very clear in my communication and never leaving any ambiguity. And that's really important if you're living and working across different cultures, different languages. Sometimes being very indirect and being very subtle in one language can be completely misunderstood. So by being, sort of direct and fair is something that I feel good about.
Right, right. We have another question from Ahmed Yusuf. As entrepreneurs, how to face the nightmare about the business? This is a very broad question. How to face the nightmare?
The nightmare about
the business.
First of all, this is what you asked for. You're an entrepreneur. You started your own business, so you wanted to be the captain, of your team. So you gotta be, it's it is tough. You have to be realistic. You have to look at things in a very sane way, in a very rational way, and don't try to sugarcoat it. And one really important thing, one of the businesses I started, after I actually raised money for it, and after about 6 months, I decided that I cannot make a real go of this. So I called my investors and I said to them, guys, this is not going to work. I've returned to them most of their money, like 85% of their money, and I shut it down. So sometimes, we're all humans. So one of the things that worries me a lot right now is seeing all of these young entrepreneurs who are thinking that if their business failed, then they are personal failures. No, you're not. There are certain times when you have to say, this is just not the right time. And you don't put yourself under so much pressure. You look at the realistic optimism. And if being realistic, you cannot see a path forward, then close down. That is not defeatist. That is not weak. That is actually courageous. That is brave. So, you don't put yourself under too much stress, and don't gamble, because if you calculate it in a realistic way and you see that the chances of continuing is very small, don't say, I'm just going to give it a go and see what happens. A controlled failure is so much better than a forced failure. And there is nothing wrong with failing once, twice, 3, 4 times.
There will always be another time, right?
Exactly.
Fight.
Yeah.
What was the phrase? Fight to live again, or live to fight?
Live to fight another day. Exactly.
I love it. I love it. I
Yeah.
love the quote, and I think it kind of sums up the whole,
Yeah.
these whole lessons that you've left us today.
Yeah.
Thank you so, so much, Ayman. It has been, we've extended a little bit. I am so sorry, but it's been really, really insightful. It's been really motivational. Despite we're talking about failure, we're talking about, a very negative situation we're living in. To know and to have the reassurance that sometimes courage means, means not quitting, but failing is quite reassuring. Well, we have one more question if you want to answer from
Sure.
Mona. Mona Timuri says, "What's your number one tip for someone who wants to become an entrepreneur? How do they enter this world correctly?"
Not now.
It's very bold.
Yeah, not now, because one of the things that is really important, if you're an entrepreneur, you have a company, you have a team, you already have products, you have all of the stuff, you can sort of switch, you can pivot, you've got certain things that you've already done through. Because when you're starting a company, at every stage, there are so many, excuse me, so many challenges and so many risks, but you've been going for a year or two, you have all of that, so you've overcome a lot of these risks. Now we can look at pivoting, we can look at cutting arms and legs, we can look at all of the things we've talked about. But if you don't have a company and you're starting now, the risk is too high, because you don't know, you don't know the landscape. You don't know, if you say I'm going to be selling to XYZ customer, you don't know if XYZ customer is going to exist or not. You don't know if XYZ customer is going to have the buying power or not, or if they're going to pivot away from whichever business you're offering them to go somewhere else. So that's why, not now doesn't mean not in the in the next 10 years. It means until you have clarity and you see where things are going. And on a global basis, a lot of people in different countries, there is no unique country in this whole thing. You're not going to have, like, I have somebody from Malaysia was talking to me and was saying, no, we have much lower rates. And then you look at Singapore, which is right in the heart of Malaysia, got completely different numbers. No, there is no uniqueness. The whole world is going to go through the same cycles. No issues of temperature, no issues of immunity, no issues of, everybody is the same in this whole thing. So when the whole world is settled, then it is time.
Right, right. Well, thank you so, so much, Ayman. It's been such a pleasure. It's been really, really insightful. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, everyone who joined. Thank you for your questions. We will see you tomorrow for another session about how to do the right PR for your startup. Thank you.
All the best. Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, guys.